My name is Josh Noem. I'm editorial director at Ave Maria Press. I want to thank you for joining us for this session, and thanks to our panelists for preparing a fascinating conversation on personhood in contemporary literature. Ave Maria Press is one of the oldest Catholic publishers in the country. We were founded by Father Soren in 1865. We've got a display table across the street at McKenna, so make sure you drop by. We've got all the fun books, Lord of the World, we've got Brian Doyle, we've got History of the Catholic Church and 100 Objects. So swing by over there, you get 20% off as well. So since I had the podium, I wanted to make a little pitch for Ave Maria Press. So let me introduce each of our panelists. Each will have about 20 minutes to talk so we can have time for question and answer afterwards. I'll offer an extended introduction before each one speaks. But with us today we have Amy Welborn, independent scholar and author. We have Sarah Zentner from Catholic University. And to begin with, we have Michael Stevens. Michael Stevens has taught English at Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan since 1997. He received his PhD from the Institute of Philosophic Studies at the University of Dallas, writing a dissertation on T.S. Eliot's socio-political vision. More recently, he has concentrated his scholarly energies on the vision of the Kentucky farmer and writer Wendell Berry, making his first pilgrimage to Lane's Landing Farm with 10 students about a year ago. He co-authored Wendell Berry in The Cultivation of Life with his colleague Matt Bonzo. He and his wife Linda have 3 grown children and 3 aging cats. So please welcome Michael Stevens.
Thanks for the introduction, Josh, and I'm honored to be on this panel, and I'm very intrigued to hear what my other panelists have to say. And the cats never get any press of any sort, so I thought I'd throw them in there. They'll never know. They'll never know, but I thought I'd throw them in there. As always, I'm honored and a tad bit daunted to be presenting here at Notre Dame at this wonderful center and this edifying and fortifying conference. I've attended so many illuminating talks here over the years. I've discovered new writers, new movements. I've been uplifted by beautiful speeches, the beauties abounding on this campus. So why, I thought to myself once again, do I seem to be moving into the darker terrain when I prepare my paper? The depressing and bleak avenues of existence as I offer my small contribution to this vast discourse about life and personhood and beauty and meaning. Why can't I ever seem to strike a happy tone when I speak here? Especially, it's one of the more beautiful days for the fall conference we've ever had here. I've seen sleet, freezing rain, and snow in years past. Especially when I'm joining a gathering here that consistently speaks about hope and truth and even the beatific vision. Well, I think I've figured it out. And it's not a very complicated thought. We are the ones who understand most fully that the world is fallen, that sin has a pervasive and insidious grip, that redemption is imperative. Our hope, the hope of Christ's gospel, his good news, is always offered in a context of darkness and even desperation. So that's why I'm going to talk about the glorious topic of human personhood. We who are a little lower than the angels, bearing the mysterious image, very image of God, and I'm going to talk about instances of crisis, loss, and dehumanization. But that, I realize, is the path to take to talk about redemptive hope. The philosopher of art, Calvin Seerveld, from whom I've learned so much, has said that if an artist is going to portray human life truthfully, he or she must show troubled joy. Anybody who's ever had my core class, Imagination and Culture, has that term emblazoned in their mind. At least we learned one phrase, troubled joy. Indeed, I've chosen to hitch the coattails, onto the coattails of an artist who does just that, shows troubled joy, and in so doing reveals both the starkness of the threats to personhood in our world and also redemptive possibilities, if ever so slim. My artist is a farmer by morning and a writer by afternoon, an essayist of sharp prophetic bearing, a poet of psalmic lament and celebration, and most essential to our topic, a fiction writer of simple grief and simple grace. This is, of course, a talk about Wendell Berry and what he has to say, or rather a commentary on the way he addresses the phenomena of what I'm calling displaced personhood in the modern world. Wendell's essays are often diagnostic, and they also have a tone of lament from time to time, but I would never say that they're nostalgic. There's a way that seems life-giving, and then there are practices afoot that are instead are destructive. And the question posed in his essays is often, how can we move from death back towards life? Obviously, Pope John Paul II popularized that very terminology. culture of life and culture of death. I think that's where Wendell Berry's fiction dwells. In the title essay of his volume, What Are People For?, a recording of which, by the way, from the Grand Rapids Public Library, was one of my first Berryan discoveries with Wendell reading his own work. That's where I learned the pacing of the Kentucky drawl. He takes on the question from the angle that people need a task, some work or calling. This is a quote from that essay, What Are People For? The great question that hovers over this issue, one that we have dealt with mainly by indifference, is the question, what are people for? Is their greatest dignity in unemployment? Is the obsolescence of human beings now our social goal? The isolated individual, even with a task, though, is not going to be able to rise to full personhood, even with a job and a clear calling. Wendell is clear in many of his other essays that people can only thrive, their tasks only be fully meaningful within a community. And here is the rub for my paper today. Communities are hard to come by. Functional and meaningful communities, a rare breed. In fact, in his aptly titled essay, The Purpose of a Coherent Community, from the volume Way of Ignorance, Berry is more troubled than joyful. Here's another quote from him. I always wonder, should I try to read with a Kentucky accent? I'm not going. Anyone from Kentucky would be affronted and offended, and I'm not going to attempt that. Upstate New York will have to do here in this case, but a coherent community is undoubtedly an excellent purpose. Perhaps we can agree that it is, but we will have to agree also, I'm afraid, that none of us lives in one. Let me take a sip here, sorry. Pardon. And that none of us knows where to find one. We have no place to begin but where we are, unquote. Berry sees the fate of every individual person is tied up in this incoherence. And though he turns toward hope, he's clear about what community and hence full personhood is up against. Here's another quote. Putting the pieces back together is going to be slow work. The pieces can be scattered in a hurry merely by indifference or neglect or violence. Those are three categories I want to keep in mind when we go to the stories. Indifference, neglect, or violence. Here's the rest of the quote. But the same forces that scattered them cannot put them back together. For that, we're going to need the hope and purpose of a coherent community, clearly articulated and steadily borne in mind. And we're going to have to resign ourselves to patience and small steps, unquote. With those three antagonists, indifference, neglect, and violence in mind, those powerful forces of depersonalization, I'm reminded of Berry's work as a fiction writer, where in his little fictional community of Port William, the striving for coherent community is constantly imperiled by institutions of mass ordering that swallow up individuals and displace their personhood, that commit acts of indifference and neglect and violence. I have in mind three stories. I'll talk very briefly about one, somewhat briefly about the other, and more extensively about the third. Three stories that show the threats to personhood, each showing the community tested to the limits. I can only briefly gloss the first story. It's called Fidelity. It's really long. It's a long short story, kind of like the Russians do. Long short stories, really long novels. It is haunted by institutional indifference, as we see probably my favorite Berryan character, Burley Coulter, now aged and ill, put into a hospital and on life support by a team of doctors who want to prepare him for a set of surgeries to potentially extend his life. When it becomes apparent that Burley's pseudo-community will be a set of machines and anonymous hospital employees, his natural son, Danny Branch, decides to kidnap him, bring him back out of the hospital home to Port William to die in peace in the woods that he often wandered in life. In an ironic riff of the notion of indifference, the Kentucky State Police send out an agent to investigate the malfeasance done by Burley's family and friends, and the officer, Detective Bode, comes to realize he has never known coherent community that he sees among these supposed criminal elements. As Detective Bode talks with Henry Catlett, a lifelong friend, sometime lawyer for Burley, along with his father Wheeler, we see the institutional view of the person contrasted with the communal, with a certain comic effect. Listen, Henry said, I'm trying to explain something to you. Pardon. I'm not the only one who won't cooperate with you in your search for Danny Branch. There are several of us here who aren't reconciled to the loss of any good thing. I'm just doing my duty, the detective said. And you're here now to tell us a person who is sick, and this is the lawyer again. You're here now to tell us a person who is sick and unconscious, even a person who is conscious and well, is ultimately the property of the medical industry and the government, aren't you? Henry was still grinning. Well, it wasn't authorized. He'd asked nobody's permission. He told nobody. He signed no papers. It was a crime. You can't let people just walk around, do what they want to like that. He didn't even settle the bill. Okay, there's insurance issues here too, okay. Some of us think people belong to each other and to God, Henry said. Are you going to let a hospital keep a patient hostage until he settles his account? I thought you were against kidnapping a while ago. End of quote. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting anybody kidnap a loved one from a hospital. If things grow frustrating, I don't think I would do so myself. But this seems most interesting in this tension is the difference in different views of personhood, an official, instrumental, legal, institutional view, and then the view of a loved one. The depersonalizing effect of neglect seems to be the heart of perhaps my favorite Barry story, a Depression-era vignette featuring the archetypal farmer of the old school, Ptolemy Towel Proudfoot, and his wife of middle age, Miss Minnie. So if the first story was indifference, this one's neglect. The story, titled The Solemn Boy, shows the ravages of economic collapse of the Depression on rural people, especially those without land and means. Even children are included in this vast neglect. Hence, as Towel finishes harvesting the last of his corn on a cold, windy November day, an ill-dressed man and ill-dressed little boy come walking up the road. Towel, moved by compassion, invites them home for lunch. Miss Minnie leaps at the opportunity. Though the man and boy are silent with a mixture of shyness and shame, Towel and Minnie, who are childless, begin to long and reach for them with arms of what can only be called a coherent community. Quote, and now the meal was ending, and what were they going to do? Towel and Miss Minnie yearned toward the nice, skinny, really pretty little boy, and the old kitchen filled with their yearning. And maybe there was no answer. Maybe that man and his little boy would just get up in silence and say, much obliged, and go away, and leave nothing of themselves at all. In desperation, Towel turns to his natural comedic nature, and he proceeds to pour a glass of buttermilk down the front of his chin and shirt. It's an act of splendid, joyful desperation, spontaneous yet utterly Towel-like. He's the comic uncle or grandpa this boy doesn't have, at least not out on the cold road in a time of want and need. Here's how the scene continues, quote, for several seconds nobody made a sound. They were all looking at Towel, and Towel, with his hair asserting itself in all directions, he has bad hair problems, and buttermilk on his chin and shirt, and alarm and wonder in his eyes, was looking at Miss Minnie. And then the titular solemn boy of the story, who in his solemnity is not fully what a boy is meant to be, not fully selved yet, to steal a line from Gerard Manley Hopkins, or a verb, receives the embrace of community, and he is fulfilled, quote, and then they heard the boy. At first it sounded like he had an obstruction in his throat, and that he worked at with a sort of strangling, and then he laughed. He laughed with a free, strong laugh that seemed to open his throat as wide as a stovepipe. It was a laugh of a boy who is completely tickled. It transformed everything. Miss Minnie smiled, and then Towel laughed his big hollering laugh, and then Miss Minnie laughed. Then the boy's father laughed, and the man and boy looked up. They all looked full into one another's eyes, and they laughed. Looking into one another's eyes, that's the end of the quote. Looking into one another's eyes, we see the full person buoyed up in a place of hospitality and embrace, and it is good, though it's only temporary here. We can hope the look and the love will be enough. We'll always stay with the boy because despite the Proudfoot's half-joking, half-weeping offer at the end to adopt the boy, the father and son leave out into the wind and snow. And then the final quote of the story, Towel and Miss Minnie watched them go and then went back into the house. Towel put on a clean shirt and jacket and cap and gloves. Miss Minnie began to clear the table. For the rest of that day, they did not look at each other. Unquote. So in their disappointment, the loss of the potential fullness of this boy, their community is broken, if only briefly. Final story of Barry, and this one taking on the dehumanizing force of institutional violence, that was our third category, is the moving account of a farmer turned soldier, Art Rowanberry, coming back home from World War II. He's walking the last 7 miles from the bus station down the river road to his home farm. The story is titled Making It Home, and it's mostly Art's silent reflection on the eradication of personhood that the violence of war revealed to him. This is one of his extended thoughts while he's walking along. Quote, "The fighting went on, the great tearing apart. People and everything else were torn into pieces. Everything was only pieces put together that were ready to fly apart, and nothing was whole. You got to where you could not look at a man without knowing how little it would take to kill him. For a man was nothing but just a little morsel of soft flesh and brittle bone inside of some clothes. And you could not look at a house or schoolhouse or church, notice those institutions, home, school, place of worship, without knowing how rightly hit, it would just shake down into a pile of stone and ashes. There was nothing you could look at that was whole, man or beast or house or tree, that had the right to stay whole very long," unquote. Art was himself severely wounded, and his convalescence is as yet incomplete as he walks down the river road, both the convalescence of his body and his spirit. Here's another quote. "And now, though he walks strongly enough along the road, he was still newborn from his death, and inside him he was tender and a little afraid," unquote. But the return is not merely to his home, it is to a coherent community, a place and a set of people within whose range and care he is complete, or as complete as he can ever be. I think of the last line of Wendell Berry's wonderful poem, Marriage. "It is healing, it is never whole." Coming down the river valley, he realizes, quote, "there was nothing around him that Art did not know," unquote. And when he finally stands at the verge of his farm, of which he is the 5th generation farmer, he sees his father and brother plowing with their mules, and then, quote, "he had to shake his head twice to persuade himself that he did not hear from somewhere off in the distance the heavy footsteps of artillery rounds striding towards him," unquote. Instead, he is greeted by his father's wonderment. I love it, expressed, his dad just says, well now, over and over again. And his younger brother, Mart, his grinning invitation back into the community. Here's what Mart says to him. "You reckon your foot'll still fit in a furrow?" Art nodded. "I reckon it still will." And then he's back on the farm. And so the work of repersoning, I believe that's my 5th neologism in this paper, so time for word invention. In this work of repersoning, Art begins as his father sends his little nephew Roy Lee, who is in awe of his soldier uncle, back to the house with an entreaty that echoes the return of the prodigal son. Here's the quote from his father. "Honey, run yonder to the house." I had to go southern accent with that, sorry. "Tell your granny to set on another plate, for we have our own that was gone and has come again. He is indeed again one of our own." I'll end with a brief case study. Straight from the source, as I visited Wendell and Tanya's farm, Lane's Landing Farm, about a year ago with 10 of my students, including Wesley, who's right here in the crowd and is forever changed by it, who were part of my Wendell Berry's Vision American Lit class. As we were driving into Port Royal, Kentucky, the doppelganger of Port William, the fictional town, Port Royal has a population of 50 people, we saw an old man by the church and cemetery who looked like he wanted to hail our van. I joked with the students, I thought that might have been Wendell excited about our arrival, but when we finally got to the farm and up the perilous hillside driveway, Wendell was waiting for us. Soon enough, though, waiting for us at first inside of his pickup with his dog, looking like he was ready to pull out and leave if we hadn't parked him in. But soon enough, he warmed up and began telling stories to the students, who were most fascinated that he was wearing black Nike socks under his work boots, by the way. And I took a few minutes to chat with Tanya, his wife of 65 years. I mentioned the old man by the church, and she immediately said, "Well, that's old Tom. He's called 911 200 times so far this year. We know he has guns. He's a problem, but he's our problem." I was struck by the sense, not of resignation, but of obligation in her tone. And I realize now that for all his problems, which were many, old Tom had one essential element that will give him a chance to find full personhood, to find dignity and purpose and meaning. It is healing, it is never whole. He lives within a coherent community. So might we all. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our next speaker is Amy Welborn, who is the author of more than 30 books on various aspects of Catholic faith and practice. Her work has been published in the New York Times, Commonweal, Dappled Things, Angelus News, and many other Catholic publications, including Ave Maria Press. She holds a BA in history from the University of Tennessee and an MA in religion from Vanderbilt University. Her most recent book is the Loyola Kids Book of Seasons, Feasts, and Celebrations, published by Loyola Press. She writes daily at her blog, Charlotte Was Both. She has 5 children and presently lives in Birmingham, Alabama. Please welcome Amy Welborn.
Thank you. Let me get our visuals set up here. Great, thank you. Bert was a good man, and yet she suddenly felt that he had done a terrible thing in lying about that lifesaver. He was so hell-bent on edification that truth had no claims on him anymore. I'm delighted to be here to, I think, introduce most of you to Wilfred Sheed's novel, The Hack, and explore how the spiritual and creative travails of the protagonist, Bertram Flax, reflect the ways in which our modes of communication shape us as persons, and in particular, our spiritual lives. Wilfred Sheed was the son of renowned Catholic apologists Frank Sheed and Maisie Ward. He was born in England, grew up on both sides of the Atlantic, moved to the United States as a young man, settled in New York, I believe on Long Island, had a long career as a critic, essayist, and novelist. He wrote regularly for the New York Times Book Review, for Commonweal, for Jubilee. One of his novel, Office Politics, was based in part on his experiences working for Commonweal. The magazine in Office Politics is not a Catholic magazine, but apparently it was based on that. He passed away in 2011, and The Hack was his second novel, published in 1963. So let's meet our protagonist, Bertram Flax. When we meet him, Bertram Flax is in his early 30s. He's making a living penning pious drivel for Catholic periodicals. He fell into it honestly because as a teen, he started writing inspirational poetry. Quote, "It had started way back in high school, poets mature early, when religiosity came as easily as breathing. They told you to think of Our Lady whenever you had an impure thought, and this led him into some rather tense poetry." So he was encouraged with his literary gifts by priests and nuns as teachers, because of course you use your gifts and talents for the church. What other better venue is there to use your gifts and talents, right? And so here he is, years later, married with 5 children, living in suburban New Jersey, eking out a living, writing inspirational stories, essays, and poems. You know, little Danny, healed by the tears of the Virgin, Father Greg, turning the lives around of the neighborhood toughs on the basketball court, that sort of thing. Bart's wife, Betty, is not Catholic, and while Bert does not aggressively work at converting her, he certainly would like his wife to become Catholic and tries not to do anything in his own life that would discourage her. Quote, he says to her, "It isn't so difficult, just pray for faith." The words tasted like ashes to him. Betty could believe anything she wanted to, of course. Her world was a great feast of possible beliefs. He hung on to what he could, fingers on a wet rock. "Tell me about purgatory," she asked. "Some other time," he smiled thinly. A man should be willing to talk to his wife about purgatory. It was the least he could do. So when we meet, it's early November. In fact, it's All Saints. He's lurking outside the parish church. Bert is lurking outside the parish church on All Saints. He can't go in. He's repelled. He's lost his faith, basically. But still, he's got to write the Christmas poem. It's due. It was quote, "It was the season to rub his hands and be genial for the passenger," a publication, "moisten his eyeballs and be tender for the Catholic woman, roll up his trousers and be childish for the tiny messenger." But he's coming up dry, very dry. He cannot enter into the Spirit. He cannot hold on to anything solid to believe in. It just seems to him to be all so many words. The Catholic mother, he was so damn tired. He couldn't keep this going much longer. With 5 wonderful kids, you needed so much money. If he could just drop the whole thing, tiptoe away, stop trying to sustain this mood. But then there were the bills, and there was pride. Bert thinks he could write deeper things, but can he? Has his writing reflexes been so bent that by this sentiment and his style that that's all he can produce now? And what about the audience? It seems to be moving on, but you're always going to have that cohort, the kind that has expectations and doesn't want to be disappointed. Quote, he had resisted giving talks for as long as possible, but with the arrival of number 4, the extra $50 or $100 became irresistible. He and Betty made out a list of topics he felt competent to talk about. The Catholic literary revival, the Catholic intellectual revival, Catholics and TV, Catholics and decent literature, Catholics and better communications. He hadn't meant to talk about communism at all because he didn't know much about it, but men's groups in East Orange wanted to hear about communism, so communism it was. Betty goes through Bert's mail, she's in charge of his communications, and tells him he has an invitation to speak to the Catholic women of Paramus. It makes him shudder. I have nothing to say to the women of Paramus. They want you to talk about vibrant living. That isn't one of your topics, is it? They'll come and pick you up. A horrible thought in itself. He shut his eyes. And then there was the pile of half-witted mail in front of his wife. You could always tell it was half-witted by the way they put on the stamps, which anybody who's ever gotten hate mail can identify with. The stamps and all caps, right? Betty senses something is wrong. Quote, she had a hunch he wanted to change his style, develop a little more depth, but with the cost of living and all, he kept putting it off from issue to issue. She was naturally optimistic and sure he would work it out. Meanwhile, he was doing so much good. This is a phrase that recurs throughout the novel. His hack writing is of the lowest common denominator, and everyone around him knows it, but he was doing so much good. He himself believes he's a fraud, but he was doing so much good. His writing might be doing him spiritual harm, but he was doing so much good. What should he do? What can the figure who's doing so much good do with his words and faith when he's having a spiritual crisis? Quote, it would be nice to talk to someone about it, though. It was only so hard to explain. If you tried telling Betty, it might keep her out of the church. If you tried telling Father Chubb, his publisher, you might never place another article in the Passenger. People expected Bert Flax to know what he was doing. Once in the anonymity of the confessional, he had actually been recommended to look up an article by Bert Flax on the subject of faith. Flax was really the fellow he ought to talk to, if he could get through to him. He thinks confronting skepticism in the person of an old high school friend might light the fire again, so he goes looking for a fight. He realized he wanted to draw Dave out, get him to say something sacrilegious. Then they could fight, and Bert would feel like a Catholic again. He remembers how it used to flow, and it was real, and it seemed natural. What he wrote early on expressed something real, but if only he hadn't dragged it around for so long, like a dead cat. So how did he get here? First of all, because religion was his job, always a risk, right? When religion is your job, that's the risk you run of it becoming your job. Secondly, his style of writing and his content malformed his faith. He wrote, and his filter was spiritual sentimentality, pietistic, superficial stuff. And he's been doing it for 15 years, and this is his filter now. His wife argues with his publisher, Father Chubb, about this, out of Bert's hearing. Father Chubb says, but then I don't think that Bert ever had the faintest idea what the church was really about, do you? And she says, well, how would I know, she said. He was the only Catholic I ever had to go on. True, he says, but even you must have felt that the things that exercised him were pretty trivial for a grown man. Seat money and dirty movies, and you say, and where angels go in the winter, such childish concerns. He seemed to have no sense of the sacramental, of sacred places and things, of liturgy and initiation into mystery. I never saw anything like that in the Passenger either, was what Betty felt like saying. The things he had described as trivial sounded like the table of contents of his magazine. So at Christmas midnight mass, Betty is shocked to watch her professionally devout Catholic husband remain in the pew at communion time. And he had told her afterwards that it was because he'd forgotten and consumed a lifesaver before Mass, which is the first quote. And she knows this is a lie. He would never do that. So she first puts this inside Bert's head. Playing with sacred things was what Father Chubb called it. And you might say your emotions were sacred things. Your tears and rages were sacred. He suddenly realized that you didn't turn them on for kicks or for money. Your talent was a sacred thing, and your faith in God was sacred. You didn't pretend it was a whit stronger than it was, even for the sake of example. And he puts this into Betty's head. He, Bert, wanted to do first-rate work, but he had trouble with it, and he did so much good the other way. The worst of it was you couldn't even blame the church. The church hadn't asked him to write anything and wouldn't care if he stopped. Every institution kept up a froth of chatter these days. It didn't much matter who did the actual frothing. 1 million tons of stupid words had to be manufactured by somebody, but getting mad at those was like getting mad at New Jersey, as Bert used to say. And it's uncanny. 1 million tons of stupid words have to be manufactured by somebody every day. So the hack is perceptive, funny, from another era, yes. But when I read it, it hit me like a ton of bricks. You know, I was like, this is still very, very pertinent for a lot of reasons, and not only because I'm in, the religion writing business. When Eve Tushnet wrote a review of this book, she focused on something else that's very important, which is the fact it's about anybody who has gone into a task, a thing, a vocation, full of fire, full of vim and vigor and talent, and then gotten, burnt out and find themselves almost malformed by what they've thrown themselves into, and then rendered unable to do much else without a great deal of sacrifice and big moves. But what I take away from this, the caution, is the ways in which, and it's just a question, the ways in which our predominant modes of communication today, spiritual communication, all communication, how does that malform our faith? So Bert's faith was bent by the fact that his religion writing was a job, as well as the superficial sentimentality of his material, what he produced as it reflected a spiritual environment and filtered it for consumption. It took him to a place of being very dry, and at the end of the novel, he does have a breakdown, a total breakdown, and has to be hospitalized. What about us? I see a few ways, but all of them have their roots in the same place, the elevation of the self, both in the message and the medium, and this continual loop of reinforcement and amplification between the two, message and medium, self, self, self. This leads to a particular, I think, peculiar faith shared as much by modes of expression and demands of the audience as Bert's was. But it all begins with the power to create. So when mid-century critics and philosophers of mass technology and mass communication made their prophecies, the Orwell, Bradbury, McLuhan, and so on, what they tended to focus on was, of course, the effect of mass communication, control of information on us as recipients. What they did not, I don't think, and maybe even could not foresee, was the impact of each of us having one of these, each of us being able to be a self-published author, filmmaker, put our tracks up on Spotify, elevate ourselves and our image, our brand, whatever, even in next door posts, right? And that's what interests me, is the impact of all of that on us. And the way I look at it, I see three aspects of that. The elevation of the self over God in religious discourse, the emphasis on the big impact that we can have, in contrast to the traditional Christian spiritual emphasis on the small, on the little way. And then, in my mind, the inversion of humility and pride. and the diminishment of humility as a virtue and the elevation of pride in its stead. I quote here from Tara Isabella Burton book called Self-Made, which is a very good, there's a lot of books out there about this phenomenon, this modern and postmodern phenomenon, Carl Trueman, all the rest, about the elevation of the self and the centrality of the self and our understanding of reality. But she says, our personal lives and our economic lives are now predicated on the assumption that artful self-expression is not just a moral requirement, but a teleological one. It is what we as human beings are for. The gods have come down to us in human form, is what each one of us faces, right? So first, the centering of personal happiness as the primary spiritual goal, therapeutic deism and all of that. Secondly, the abandonment of religious authority, external religious authority, in favor of something is authoritative to us if it makes me feel a certain way, right? Or if the person who is telling me about it is telling me about their feelings, and that strikes me as authoritative. In the internet world, in this world, not just the internet world, we are the center of our spiritual journeys. Our good feelings right now are the object of our search. And of course, the media we all communicate just amplifies that. So it's a world the internet world privileges expression of any sort that elevates and centers the person, our experiences, our appearance. And whatever the popular flavor of the month happens to be, molds that then, right? Authenticity, messiness, vulnerability, deconstructing, recovering, trad wife, Chad bro, own the cons, own the trads, own the libs, whatever. The format has changed, pamphlets replaced by Instagram posts and sentimental tales supplanted by first-person accounts of self-acceptance, but the dynamic is the same. Secondly, the world set the world on fire. Poor Catherine of Siena. Very quickly, I just have to go through these very quickly. Since we can reach anywhere with this, right? It's evolved into the assumption that just because we not only have the ability, we have the responsibility. You have gifts and talents. What, you're only like taking soup to your neighbor and getting her groceries? Shouldn't you be trying to change the world? Because you can. And so I look to that as another example of how this and the elevation of the self is impacting and bending our own faith. And finally, humility. The most profound thing, I think, is the inversion of virtue and vice, of humility and pride. Traditional ancient spirituality centered smallness, anonymity, self-sacrifice, the little way. There isn't a Christian spiritual teacher whose central message was, just put yourself out there. Put yourself out there, yes, with courage to serve and sort of love until they crucify you, yeah. But when you have mixed up all of this stuff about self-expression being the highest value and the purpose of human life, and the means to do it on a big scale, we think, then there we are. We are caught up in this world, unless we choose to recognize it and say no to it, in which humility becomes a vice. Mary Harrington is the author of the book Feminism Against Progress and the Substack Reactionary Feminism, and she had a post the other day on digital modesty, which I highly recommend. And she ends it by saying, digital modesty is a general disposition, an effort, however difficult it is in practice, to avoid any form of on-life self-presentation that veers into spectacle. And I have more, but you can go read that yourself. Thomas Merton, in Seeds of Contemplation, which is a book about the liturgy, he reflects on this. He says, Christian personalism does not root out the inner secret of the individual in order to put it on display in a spiritual beauty contest. And finally, let's return to Bert and Betty. It's all about, how our faith bends us. How the medium and the message bends us and bends our faith. But whether we are bent by the sentimentality of Bert's travails or our own unending pressures to put ourselves out there and change the world, I think all of us, Bert and us, ultimately find ourselves yearning for silence, don't we? So he thinks, or Betty thinks, religion must sometimes mean just keeping silent, not trying, sorry, I gotta get my glasses on for this, not trying to coin phrases or drum up thoughts. Bert once wrote a thing about keeping quiet, about the silence of Christ, and it chimed with something she felt herself. She had said, yes, that's it. He understands. But even that was just talk. He had no intention of imitating Christ's silence himself. All he had left with was the words, and he was calling on them now for our final assault on the Christmas bills. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Last but not least, we have Sarah Zentner, who is a PhD candidate in English at the Catholic University of America, where she is currently working on a dissertation that explores the relationship between religion and late 19th century asceticism. She's also a writer and editor for Blessed is She, a Catholic women's ministry dedicated to community and prayer. Please welcome Sarah Zentner.
Thank you, Josh. I'm delighted to be here. Thought experiments concerning the use of artificial intelligence are helpful for evaluating the nature of personhood, for we can help clarify our understanding of who the human is by determining what it is not. A human is not merely an intelligent, intelligible being capable of knowing and producing. A human is, first and foremost, made in the image and likeness of a Trinitarian God, the Imago Dei. This fact bestows upon each of us an intrinsic dignity and affirms our highest calling as participants in an exchange of love with God and with others. In this paper, I propose that Kazuo Ishiguro's 2021 novel, Klara and the Sun, emphasizes John Paul II's theology on the unrepeatability and givenness of the human person, while paradoxically using artificial intelligence to remind us of the nature of true communion. The future painted by Klara and the Sun is a dreary one. Amid familiar dangers like rampant pollution exist more sinister problems. Adolescence, for example, can be genetically optimized by a process called lifting. If successful, the procedure is supposed to ensure a good life for the recipient, perhaps removing him or her from the anxiety of genetic illness, for instance. But it comes with implied questions about what makes a good life. One in which we're in perfect health, or one in which we're fully loved. And it poses significant risks, the largest of those being illness and death. This is where Klara's story begins. An artificial friend programmed to provide companionship for a child, Klara is selected for Josie, a teenager who has been lifted and is subsequently in ill health. Readers eventually discover, however, and massive spoiler alert, if you have not read the book, I apologize, it's not too late to leave, no hard feelings. Klara is not simply hired to care for Josie, but to replace her if Josie's being lifted should prove fatal. In spite of this rather ominous premise, early reviewers of the novel, especially in faith-based circles, almost unanimously observed irrepressible hope in its pages, noting Klara's endearing sense of wonder at the world around her, the tender sympathy of the narrative voice, and the love that lies at the heart of the novel's thematic concerns. I join these voices to explore yet another hopeful vision this novel casts, an affirmation of the unrepeatable dignity of each human person and a gentle reminder of what we owe to each other as people made in the image of God, and to suggest, if somewhat radically, that an android can help us construe an understanding of this vision. To anchor my analysis and to place it within a Catholic context, I'll be using some key concepts from John Paul II's 1978 Christmas message, his 1994 meditation on givenness, and his landmark work on human relationships, love, and responsibility. The novel speaks most profoundly to the idea of unrepeatable personhood in a pivotal scene that occurs about 2/3 of the way through the narrative. Klara accompanies Josie and her parents on a trip to see the portrait man, Mr. Henry Capaldi, whom we soon learn is not painting what any of us would consider to be a portrait in its usual two-dimensional sense. Instead, he is rendering a lifelike three-dimensional facsimile of Josie, one that Klara is intended to inhabit should Josie pass away. In this way, according to Mr. Capaldi, Klara, quote, really will be Josie, a continuation of Josie, end quote, that will save Josie's family from grief in the event that she does not get well. Now, without the concept of unrepeatable personhood, perhaps Mr. Capaldi's project seems a logical solution to the consuming pain of human grief and a way to thwart the inevitability of death. If someone in all of his or her complexity can be whittled down to a programmable series of personality traits, a collection of memories, and a set of physical characteristics, then why wouldn't it be possible to download those features into a computer for the sake of retaining and continuing them? A person who believed such a thing were possible would declare, as Mr. Capaldi does, that there is, quote, nothing inside Josie that's beyond the Klaras of this world to continue. The second Josie won't be a copy. She'll be the exact same, end quote. For Mr. Capaldi, the person can be reduced to a set of data points, but Catholic theology tells us this could never be the case. In a monologue that feels, at least to this Catholic reader, redolent of the unrepeatability that colors John Paul II's writings on the human person, Josie's father, Paul, explains why such a reductive view fails to satisfy. Do you believe in the human heart? He asks. I don't mean simply the organ, obviously. I'm speaking in the poetic sense, the human heart. Do you think there is such a thing? Something that makes each of us special and individual? And if we just suppose that there is, then don't you think in order to truly learn Josie, you'd have to learn not just her mannerisms, but what's deeply inside her? Wouldn't you have to learn her heart? No matter how many statistics we or some piece of technology might be able to rattle off about another individual, no matter what he or she might vulnerably choose to disclose, we could never know that person's heart, not in its fullest, deepest sense. Klara and Paul grapple with this reality by comparing Josie's innermost being to a series of rooms. Paul suggests its labyrinthine infinitude, while Klara asserts that no matter what, there must eventually, quote, be an end to what there is to learn. But Paul remains unconvinced, one of the sentimental types Mr. Capaldi patronizes for an old-fashioned, naive belief that, quote, there's something unreachable inside each of us, something that's unique and won't transfer, end quote, something unrepeatable. In his 1978 Christmas message, the first one he delivered after assuming the papacy, John Paul II issued this statement, quote, for God and before God, the human being is always unique and unrepeatable. Somebody thought of and chosen from eternity, someone called and identified by his own name, end quote. On the basis of this declaration, the question of whether Klara can replace Josie is already a moot point. But there's something else at stake when advancements in artificial intelligence gain increasing ground. The incarnation, John Paul II continues, is the beginning of a new power for humanity itself, the power open to every man in accordance with the words of St. John. he gave power to become children of God. When the Pope praises all institutions who, quote, enable the life of human beings in its various aspects to become ever more human, it is reasonable to conclude that what makes the world, quote, ever more worthy of man is, for John Paul II, an attentiveness to systems and practices that assert human dignity by recognizing the end for which we have been created, unity with God, and the immortal nature of our souls. With every new technology, we should ask whether it will be a help or a hindrance in this manner. But one problem with the exponential rise of artificial intelligence in recent years, we could argue, a problem deftly explored in Ishiguro's novel, is that many so-called technological advancements neither make us more human nor the world more worthy of man in the way I've just described. In a 2022 article for the journal Daedalus, John Tasioulas observes that current AI use seems largely governed by principles that aim to maximize individual pleasure or benefit, regardless of the means employed to get there. There are, of course, obvious ethical problems with this approach, which assumes that something of benefit to the individual is the only thing that matters, without regard for the common good. But even when the goal of AI is arguably a laudable one, the preservation of objectivity and maintaining justice, or diagnosing a serious medical condition, for example, reliance on artificial intelligence can risk neglecting the complexity of factors at play, or deny workforce participation, however imperfect, that many people would agree constitutes a vital component of a meaningful life. Thus, in an attempt to enhance human life, AI can too easily displace the individual and compromise one essential aspect of what makes us human, our belonging to a community. In place of the, quote, preference-based utilitarianism that dominates current uses of artificial intelligence, and very much in concert with John Paul II's thinking, Tasioulas proposes a humanistic ethics that determines appropriate application by considering why and how AI is used as no less important than what it produces. In this way, we might begin, alongside technology more broadly and AI more specifically, to produce a society that is more worthy of man, one that makes all of us more human. But we don't see this kind of society represented in Klara and the Sun. In a world that feels perhaps eerily similar to our own and yet more grotesque, more frightening, the kids who are lifted are programmed to perfection, more machine than human. It is hardly a world that is worthy of man, and neither is it a society that necessarily makes its inhabitants more human in the manner of becoming more Christ-like. And the best illustration of this technological advancement not enabling virtuous behavior is one devastating scene in which the genetically lifted kids unrepentantly mock Rick, Josie's unlifted best friend and love interest. But if we become more human by becoming more children of God, if our highest call is to love others as Christ loved us, to give ourselves in love and be received as gifts in turn, then we see this dynamic dramatized in two contrasting relationships within the novel. In John Paul II's seminal work, Love and Responsibility, he defines the disinterested nature of true charity as goodwill, which is, quote, quite free of self-interest. Goodwill is the same as selflessness in love, not I long for you as a good, but I long for your good. I long for that which is good for you. The person of goodwill longs for this with no selfish ulterior motive, no personal consideration. Love as goodwill is therefore love in a more unconditional sense than love desire. It is the purest form of love, end quote. In other words, charity wishes the good of the other without any view toward oneself. It does not seek to possess, to use, or to otherwise benefit from another, but loves the other for his or her own sake. The most pronounced challenge to goodwill in Klara and the son occurs within the relationship between Josie and her mother, Chrissy, while the relationship between Josie and Rick allows us to glimpse its fulfillment. Yet, it is the character of Klara who, as an android, is a good in its literal, marketable, and consumable sense, yet is also somehow capable of willing Josie's good in the most powerful way. The possibility for Klara to continue Josie makes Josie's mother, Chrissy, blinded by the fear of loss, possessive, selfish, and clingy. Do this for me, Chrissy pleads with Klara. Not for the good of the other, for Josie, but because if Klara doesn't, quote, there's going to be no other way for me, that is the mother, to survive, end quote. This desperation is not the kind of self-gift to which we are called in imitation of Christ's own death on the cross, but Rick's willingness to let go offers a different perspective. His efforts on behalf of Josie are made for her, without clinging, without possessing. He receives her as a gift for as long as he's able with open-handed detachment. And, another spoiler alert, even though the story ends happily, hooray! With Josie getting well again, her relationship with Rick does not last. He says that they once, quote, really loved each other, but now they, quote, have to wish each other the best and go our different ways. But Josie and I will always be together at some level, some deeper one, even if we go out there and don't see each other anymore, end quote. Rick recognizes that his love for Josie will endure even if they are separated. And in willing her good, he surrenders her. He receives her as a gift, but never seeks to possess her in the way that her mother does, thereby exhibiting what John Paul II refers to in his 1994 meditation on givenness as a, quote, disinterested liking. This disinterestedness seeks not personal gain, but the good of the other. And it is a reflection of the Lord's own creative and fatherly favor toward us, a love that wills the good of the created for their own sake. Astonishingly, however, it is the android, Klara herself, who, in a grand paradox, seems most capable of giving the disinterested charity so integral to the expression of our human dignity. This self-sacrificing love arises from our being made in the image and likeness of God, and its manifestation in Klara is curious because, well, as a machine, she's not made in God's image. Yet, the novel nevertheless, in Isabel Senechal's words, blurs the boundary between human and machine. Klara is an artificial friend. This designation denotes her role as a companion to a human child, signifying relationality, but it also reduces the vital significance of interpersonal relationships to something that can easily be substituted with mechanics. Although she can intuit others' feelings and even experience something of them herself, Klara is, for instance, very sad to hear about the death of Josie's older sister, Sal. She cannot, as Senechal further observes, reliably cultivate empathy in the manner of a human being. This muddle of human and non-human characteristics establishes Klara as not quite human, not quite machine, yet more than mere automaton. Klara's appreciation for the beauty of the world further confuses the distinction between human and machine. John Paul II writes that the love we are able to express toward another is carved from, quote, an interior space of loving predilection that is especially governed by beauty, and is fulfilled in, quote, a certain quest for beauty, for yet new forms of incarnation and new sources of wonder, which is as indispensable to man as food and drink. The grim world of Klara and the sun is, as I've already indicated, somewhat lacking in observable beauty, but one notable exception comes in the case of Klara's pervasive sense of wonder and enchantment, and in the case of her real hope in the special kindness of the sun to revive Josie. As Joy Clarkson remarks, Klara lives in a world that has given up on humanity and on faith, and yet through her mechanical eyes, we see a world sustained by faith and permeated by love. That manifestation of beauty finds its fulfillment in an intercessory prayer to the sun for Josie's healing, and even this is a last-ditch attempt to save Josie, after Klara first attempts to do so by sacrificing some of her own vital mechanical fluid. These are acts we might well consider to be ones of love, and the intermingling of the human with AI in the text does not place such a distinctly human emotion outside the realm of possibility for Klara. Klara thus flips the word belonging on its head, for although in one sense she is in Josie's possession, her act of love demonstrates a keen understanding of her belonging to Josie in a greater sense, one that has much to teach us about our human calling to become more human and to be children of God. B.J. Lewis reflects in a review of the novel For Dappled Things that although Josie is grateful for Clara's accompaniment throughout her teenage years, she remains oblivious to what Clara's friendship has meant for her, or what risks Klara took to fulfill her calling to be friend to Josie. Yet Klara accepts this without bitterness. She has given without counting the cost. She has emptied herself. Whatever boundaries between human and technology the novel may be intending to trouble, however, it is conclusive on this point. An android, however much it might be able to approximate the human experience, can never become human itself. When Chrissy and Klara take a trip to Morgan's Falls, Chrissy test drives her plan for Klara, commanding her to be Josie in her daughter's stead. What follows is a hesitation from Chrissy so slight yet so heartbreaking we could miss it if we aren't reading carefully. Though she commends Clara's imitation, even converses with her as if she is Josie, she first says, "I wish you, Josie, were here, but you're not." In spite of Clara's best efforts and Chrissy's ardent hopes to the contrary, Josie simply cannot be replaced by an android, and neither can any of us. So, what are we to do with all of this? We who live in a world that seems to be teetering on the brink of the fiction that Ishiguro sets forth. I started writing this paper because it feels like a short jump from technology replacing human jobs or student writing in the classroom, hello ChatGPT, to technology replacing humans altogether. I wanted to examine that problematic idea and do my little part to reclaim what makes us human, unable to be replicated, replaced, or continued by machines. But Ishiguro's novel is only partly interested in disturbing us with the implications of what such a thought experiment might mean for the way that we live and work, and how it threatens to devalue the complexity of the human heart. It is also a call to action. You see, Klara doesn't imitate what humans already are. She imitates the best of what we are called to become. Self-gift, given and received, loving others, loved in return. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We've got plenty of time for a good conversation here, so the next 15 minutes is open for questions. Yeah, in the back there.
Thank you all so much for your talk. I have a question I have a question that is ordered to everyone's talks, but in particular, Ms. Welborn, to yours, on the role of children in this reclaiming, to use your phrase, in the role of children in this reclaiming of what it means to be human. I know, Dr. Stevens, you mentioned the solemn boy, and you mentioned being children of God as well, Ms. Zentner, but the role of the children for Bert and Betty in particular, I'm just curious, like, and you guys can chime in on your respective topics as well, but the role of Betty and Bert's children in this Bert's reclaiming in some way throughout the novel.
Yeah, well, when I read The Hack, it reminds me a little bit of a novel from the same period by David Lodge, The British Museum is Falling Down, which also has a struggling young academic in this, in that situation with a lot of children, 4 or 5, I can't remember. So it's in that pre-Vatican II, pre-Humana Vitae era in which large families were normative, but they were still, I don't know, there's just no sense, there is just a little sense in The Hack that all of these children are a hassle, right? I mean, they love them, but they are scrappy and messy and all of that kind of thing. But at the same time, there's not a sense that Bert is saying, or even Betty, but especially Bert is saying that their lives would be better, that it's the children's fault. It's not the children's fault. It's their own, his own fault for allowing his talent to use this way. So, unfortunately, maybe it's not some kind of like the children present a redemptive kind of presence in this or anything like that. They're not in Sheed's world. And I don't know how many. I don't think he had any children. I think he had stepchildren, but I'm not sure. Yeah, children are not like kind of a reason for living, and yeah, no, not in his world.
One of the angles that I took on it was, as you were asking it, was why does it hurt us more to see kids that are kept from personhood, right? That are in some way from Oliver Twist onward, I guess, the Oliver Twist phenomena onward. I'm not going to break into song, Food Glorious Food, although I know lunch, the smorgasbord thing, but one of the things that came to my mind was not just with the Solemn Boy, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm not quite picking it up here, but not just with the Solemn Boy, but with their neighbor boy, Elton Penn, who has a mean stepdad who abuses him. Tal Proudfoot says, I'm going to take this boy for a little while when he sees the guy hit his stepson, and takes him under his wing and attempts to be a parent to him, right? I mean, he doesn't say, I'm your dad now, but he attempts to give him that which children need to grow into fully fledged human beings. There's a valuation in that we all recognize and maybe are even drawn to, that I think is really, that call to us, right? We all feel that is maybe God-given, that these children are meant to receive kind of the full extent of what they are made to be. And maybe we all have to take a role in that, even beyond our own children, right? In the lives of others and so on, to make that really happen.
This is such a good question, and just to piggyback off of your comment, Michael, on how it's particularly painful to see children who are kept from full personhood. I think that's part of the tragedy and the tension that Ishiguro is highlighting in his work. We have this procedure that's present in this novel that in theory is supposed to maximize children's potential, but what we see is that it really harms them in the way of sort of hindering their belonging to a community and family life and just in terms of their health. And I think if we were going to think about the redemptive capacity of children in this novel, I would say that really comes through in the character of Klara, who's not a child per se, but she does have a sense of childlike wonder and joy and just a sense for the beauty of the world that is strikes me as such a childlike way of engaging with that. And that maybe that, I mean, if I were going to hang my hat on any founding principle and that would make us more human or help us reclaim our humanity, I think it would be that, a greater attention to beauty and a greater cultivation of wonder.
I was just going to say in passing, any experience I've had with a Chat GPT essay submitted, not wonder, not a sense of wonderment in the world and so on, something very different than that.
We have a second question here, yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you for your excellent presentations. Amy, a question for you. Do you know if Wilfrid Sheed was in any way informed or influenced by Carol Houselander? Because I know she was such a good friend of both his parents and a writer in her own right, especially of children's work.
I'm just going to have to say no. I don't know.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know that, yeah. Okay,
Yeah, I mean, as far as, he didn't write much about faith
right.
outside of this novel and references in some other novels, except for when he was writing for Commonweal. So, I mean, perhaps he wrote something there, but that was only for a short time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Dr. Stevens, when you speak of healing and never being whole in community, is there a healing that comes prior to community, or is it in the lived community that we are then healed for further community?
By the way, that's a really tough poem to read at a wedding. I've seen it done. It is healing, it is never whole. We hurt each other and we are painful. Yeah. So yeah, it's. Yeah, I've thought about those lines a lot and thinking of, kind of Orthodox Christian vision where we're already in God's kingdom. We're not yet in God's kingdom. We are Christ's emissaries to the world. Satan is still the prince of the power of the air, right? There's this strange kind of, so I take it that the work that we do it's not provisional, like healing. Is that a gerund or a participle? I'm an English teacher, but I'm kind of sleep deprived from getting up early to drive down here. But participle, the healing that we're doing is real. It's part of the kingdom work, right? But we're not going to see it fully fledged. And I guess maybe the Ishiguro novel brings out, sometimes we attempt to, we see things go awry in our attempts to bring about healing, to bring about, although it's too late for my kids, I don't know what lifting adolescence means, but I'm interested in navigating adolescence with your kids. But yeah, we try to do things that will somehow solve. I just find that it takes the pressure off to say healing, we're going after something, we're trying to staunch the wounds, we're trying to like hold each other, help each other convalesce, but we'll be healed in Christ's presence, right? That kind of takes the pressure off in this life. It doesn't make you defeatist. It, in fact, maybe encourage it. We feel more victorious hanging in there with the power of the Holy Spirit in some way. I think it's a great question about how we're to live in the here and now. Anyone else?
Yeah, question in the back there.
I had a question for Professor Stevens regarding coherent community. Since not everyone has the chance to start a homestead in Kentucky or go to a farm to find the good life, do you have any thoughts on fostering that kind of communality in an age of globalization, especially in our more urban culture?
Yeah, and I think probably the other speakers could speak on that too, that it's the thing we're all striving for. I think Wendell says in that essay, rarely have any of us ever seen it, right? It's, again, healing, striving toward. To me, it starts with household. Is your household, are the practices of your household, whatever that might be, those which allow people to feel they can be themselves, they can be fully themselves, they feel safe, they feel. And then I'm taking him pretty literally because that essay is a lot about place as well as people. So I've joined my neighborhood association in Grand Rapids, northeast side of the city. There's 11,000 people in the neighborhood, so I don't know, it's not really a neighborhood, but just walking around our two streets, handing out neighborhood newsletters and saying, hey, what are your concerns? Trying to get to know people face to face who I could actually know, and asking them what their needs are and what their flourishing is. It has to be intelligibly sized, right, that you could actually know and communicate with these people. That brings up the idea of, any kind of social media community, iPhone community, or if you are in the sort of like tail end of things, Android community, as I was given an Android by my kids. How many people can you know face to face? That's why I talk to students about politics. Hey, get interested in like city commissioner race, or somebody who could actually kind of see everybody who's going to vote for them, could actually meet everybody, or you could have a town meeting and everybody could be together and talk about your concerns and needs on your 5 streets. There you start to get at something that there's probably a deeper spiritual element to talk about your parish or your church. That we've been in the same church for 27 years. You know everything good, bad, and ugly that's going on there, right? You know these people really well. That's just it. There's a community there, somewhat coherent, that you strive toward. Thoughts on coherent community?
Yeah, I mean, I think this directly applies to some of the things I was trying to say or would like to have said more about. But I think that one of the things I've observed over the past 25 years of internet life is that sense of, when the internet first came about 20 years ago, a lot of people, me included, you experienced a sense of relief because you could find people around the world that were like your tribe, right? That maybe you couldn't find in your local community. And so there was a sense of, wow, okay, I may feel like a real loner here in my, right. Oh yeah, in my parish or in my town or whatever, but there's people across the, country who feel the same way I do about this political issue or this church issue or whatever, or, have similar, physical issues or whatever. And that's all good. I mean, the person sitting in the front row is one of my very good friends, and I met her through the internet, We wouldn't have met without that. So I'm not here to, cast 100% aspersions, but what is the danger is allowing that to replace and to kind of feel virtuous about the fact that I've got this global kind of community of folks all over the world that are, the first people I think of in the morning when I wake up, but do I know my neighbor's name? That's what it all comes down to for me.
Yeah, I would say the biggest factor in creating a strong sense of community is just becoming rooted where you are. Because you can do that anywhere, regardless of whether you live in a city or you live in a town or you live in a rural community. And I say this as a millennial. We're sometimes maligned for transient nature, and also as the product of a military family that didn't have the benefit of growing up in a single community when I was a child. But now, as an adult, I see tremendous value in just investing myself in the community where I am, with the people and the events and the things that are happening there. So rootedness is probably the main word I'd pass on there.
Please join me in thanking our panelists one more time.